Commissioners. So I'm going to introduce Dante here. He's been with the city about 6 months, and he's going to be doing this presentation on small cell wireless. He's our right-of-way and construction manager. He comes to us from the state of Louisiana, and we're happy to have him. He's been here just a short time, and he's jumping in with both feet. So I told him that given that this was his first attempt, you guys would be really nice to him. So keep that in mind.
Good luck with that.
I told him that too, actually. So some of you may know about small cell wireless. It's something that's been knocking on our door for a little while now. And the region is looking at small cell and how to deal with small cell. And so we've been paying attention to that regional conversation. Dante's been doing a good job with that. And we wanted to put together some information that would both be interesting and informative, but not dabbling too far into the weeds. So Dante's kind of taking a stab at making a presentation that you'll enjoy. So we'll go on with that. I think really what I wanted to suggest to you, because there's some factual information here, but really at the end of the day, and this is a work session, we're not necessarily asking you for decisions, but we want to know really how important is it that what these facilities should look like, right? That's kind of a subjective thing, and there's not really an industry standard, although they're making big gains in the industry about making them look better. So how important is that? Should the city be more or less restrictive through process or standards? Do we want to make it easy, or do we want them to hold to a pretty high standard in terms of development of these sites? And then when establishing right-of-way user fees for small cells, should the city set fees and rates that encourage or discourage the use of small cells? So those are kind of things that I think would be easy if we had an industry standard, and we may get there. And Dante's going to talk about that, but think about those things.
So before we bring Dante up, I just want to be clear to the electeds here that there are things going on in Washington, D.C. to restrict our ability to control this 5G thing that's coming. So I would pay attention on, the League of Oregon Cities. I pay attention every day to U.S. Conference of Mayors that sends that information. But there are attempts at the congressional level from these companies to subvert our right to control our own right-of-way. With that, Dante.
Thank you, Mayor, and good afternoon, City Commission. Thank you for the opportunity to present to you guys. Tonight I'll be talking about an Oregon City perspective to small cell wireless and 5G. 5 major topping points that we'll be talking about tonight are the telecommunication industry changes, how we're moving to a 5G deployment throughout the whole nation, the infrastructure that the 5G deployment requires, small cells, macro cells, the fiber installation within the right-of-way, the governing bodies and legislation that has been part of the hot topic, small cell deployment and how those affect Oregon City with home rule authority, the impacts on Oregon City, the impacts on the right-of-way, usage fees, registration, stuff like that, and the planned action that the Public Works Department believes could potentially yield to a reasonable, fair management of the right-of-way.
So Dante,
yes, sir.
Can you explain 5G and what we have now?
My next slide. So this is a little overview. If we can go through the whole all the slides, and I'll come back to any questions that you guys have. Hopefully this will give you some information that can give you some background as to what the necessities that Oregon City has within the right-of-way, and how we can get a reasonable, fair compensation and management of the right-of-way.
So one of the most scary things about what these companies are trying to do is they're trying to get legislation to say that cities or municipalities, whoever it is, have to give space on our buildings for free to these companies to do this.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'll go through all of that, and we'll have questions at the end.
Okay.
Thank you. So 5G, we've through the years, there's been many changes in the telecommunication sectors. Our everyday lives have changed, you know, from the use of cell phones to make calls, to the use of cell phones to take your emails, to nowadays we stream TV on cell phones. We use cell phones as an everyday handheld device.
So what is a G?
A G is a broadband. It's a frequency that the cells or that the telecommunication companies use to interconnect their wireless
You're
networks.
talking about gigahertz?
It's a radio frequency wave. So it's not, yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So 5Gs it would be the deployment of, you know, your cars intertwining with your handheld devices and your phone looking through your doorbells and stuff like that. The deployment of 5G is said to have a $275 billion investment by the telecommunications to deploy 5G throughout the nation by 2020. The deployment is and will require macro cell sites, small cell sites, and fiber to be placed within the right-of-way. Macro cell sites versus small cell sites. Macro cell sites are generally 200 to 400 feet in height. They're used for coverage. Currently within Oregon City, there's 9 macro cell sites. They're all placed within private property. The picture to your left is the only macro site within Oregon City that is on public property. It's on top of the Boynton Reservoir on South End. In comparison, small cells are generally placed at a height of 30 to 40 feet. They're used in high density capacity areas, and they're used for the trafficking of data through the wireless networks. By 2020, wireless facility deployment will be 80% small cell. The graphic above shows the changes in Oregon communications from 2000 to 2016. The wireless lines outline the cell phone usage, calls, data, text message, broadband outlines the internet usage of every household, and subscriptions. Wire lines, you can tell, have declined through the times, and the population has increased steadily through 2000 to 2016. The astonishing fact here is that the population increase is only 20%, while we see the usage of wireless and broadband subscribers really skyrocket. Currently within Oregon City, the current right-of-way users within Oregon City are AT&T, Verizon, Comcast, and CenturyLink. They're all placing fiber within the right-of-way at the moment, which is thought to be a process that would bring the 5G eventually. Currently, the only private property macro sites are all the wireless providers, and the right-of-way program believes that the current macro site providers would be applying for small cell deployment. Small cell legislation, the United States Congress introduced a bill, and the FCC have introduced legislation preempting the Home Rule Authority and to accelerate the deployment of small cells. The National Conference of State Legislators has shown that 20 states throughout the nation have already adopted small cell legislation. The National Conference, or the National Governors Association, the National League of Cities, and the National Association of Telecommunication Officers and Advisors have all made remarks about how the preemption of local authority has or will just put up another barrier to the deployment of small cells. Currently, Oregon City Code, currently in the Municipal Code, Chapter 13.24, telecommunication facilities is where all of the right-of-way for right-of-way guidelines and governing code is for the telecommunication facilities. including locations, construction, permitting processes, all of that. What 13.24 does not address is the sitting or the placing of small cells within the right-of-way and the usage fee for the placing of small cells within the right-of-way. 17.8 is a communications facility code, which talks about the placement of macro sites on private property and the land use applications for it. It generally encourages co-location, generally encourages shrouding, all land use applications that standards that should be implemented into the small cell standard code. Here we see a typical small cell installation. There's a utility pole much in a downtown corridor, much like something we would see on Main Street and 14th down here. In Oregon City, we see that the primary electric distributions are at the top of the pole. Then we see some communication lines followed by a street light. The bottom four, facilities are what the small cell installation would be composed of. It would have an electric meter, disconnection switch, and then an antenna. Generally, that's a canister antenna. What the right-of-way program would have to consider with the installations would be ADA compliance, the permissions to use the utility poles, and the desired shrouding of the installation.
So what do you do about situations like downtown where we're trying to get poles gone, or neighborhoods that, currently have all their utilities underground?
That's something that we would look into. We don't foresee the installation of any new poles within the right-of-way. So the utility companies would have to propose a location, and that location would have to fall under certain standards and guidelines.
So for instance, we're building several new subdivisions up off of Central Point and other places. Mm-hmm. Those are all underground utilities. So are they going to have to actually place a pole then right away? No, we just would. The utility company generally would not ask for a place. There wouldn't be a place for them to put that. We would just, in the standard, we'd write no new poles would be able to be placed within the right of way. I think
could they utilize an existing street light pole?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. Sorry. Okay. Yeah, I'll go over the locations and the placement regulations on the standards slide. Here we go. So the right-of-way management believes that there's standards that would promote a reasonable and fair management of the right-of-way. These standards include location, so within the right-of-way, the zoning, if it's a residential, commercial use, the street classifications, Molalla is a major arterial, we would maybe have more there, or on the collectors as opposed to local streets and the impacts that it would have on everyday residential use. The infrastructure, to your question, Mayor, there would be the use of the utility poles. It could be on traffic signals. It could be installations on bus stop poles, any of the structures within the right-of-way as of right now. Permissions, we did require the permissions be a permission set forth by the utility pole owner, permission from the in a structural liability way as to the safety of the right-of-way, and permission from the residential as to what shrouds are required per the zoning area. Permits and removal would all fall under Oregon City Municipal Code Title 13, telecommunications within the right-of-way. Here's a couple typical installations. To your left, there's two pictures of the antenna canister installation. It's a typical installation on top of a wood utility pole. The antenna canister allows for a more diverse angle of disbursement. If you can see the ground equipment here on the photo to the left is enclosed in a box and is shrouded. The ground equipment on the photo to the right is more visible. You can kind of see the conduits and the other electrical switches and stuff. The photo on the right is an actual installation on Hawthorne in Portland, Oregon. The second type of installation would be a monopole shrouded installation. It's a typical street light that has all of the ground facilities and all the antenna facilities shrouded, it would be an aesthetic yes or no pleasing to that residential or zone. The two installations to the right are installations misguided installations. Generally, they look like they were small cell deployments that look like macro cells. They are macro sites. They generally have more antennas, and none of the equipment seems to blend in with the residential and/or commercial zones. Currently, usage fees within Oregon City, all the right-of-way users for the telecommunications pay a 5% gross revenue, and there's a current attachment fee of $5,000. Currently, nobody's paying the attachment fee. We don't have anyone within the right-of-way on attachment fees. Other agency fees you could see below, and then Oregon City consideration for future fees. We'd like to have the 5% gross revenue per our ordinance, and then we'd look at attachment fees in an objective way of other municipality comparisons, and then the size of the antenna and ground equipment, and that impact on the right-of-way, the capacity output of the small cells, a radio frequency propagation map to talk to the environmental aspect of it, and then the residential zone classification or commercial classification, and a review and processing fee for the amount of influx that we would see on the permitting side. Next steps, we believe in the right-of-way program believes that within the next 6 to 12 months, the establishment of small cell code, the establishment of small cell standards within the right-of-way, and the establishment of usage fees would allow for a reasonable and fair implementation of management of the right-of-way. Any questions? It's a lot, sorry.
So that'd be 5% gross per year,
Just
be
as
the revenue side of it.
that's what we're looking into right now. We're trying to compare our usage fees with, the national
How do you
usage
measure
fees,
that?
but Oregon City usage fees too. In what aspect, Mayor? You measure
Well,
it.
5% gross revenues, but how do you measure that at a particular?
So the services that they provide within Oregon City. So all the telecommunication providers let's say Comcast or a telecommunication provider has fiber within the right of way. The service that they provide within anybody that is within Oregon City that they provide service for, that would be gross revenue that we would get 5% for the use of the right of way for.
But small cell's different than that. So small cell is.
It's a wireless.
It's terrifying, actually, because you're talking about your toaster being able to talk to your dishwasher, being able to talk to your television. So I question how we can find that 5% gross revenue when, my device, as I drive through different communities, connects with all kinds of different systems.
The telecommunication companies usually charge by gigabytes used per device. So you would get a monthly statement at 10 gigabytes used per device, and then that revenue that was found in Oregon City would then be part of the 5% that we would get. That's generally what we would use for wireless companies.
Isn't that what
It's going to be complicated.
It is complicated.
And so that's the other reason for the pole attachment fee and some of those other fees that we're looking at. So
Okay.
I still think it's questionable as how we, for instance, I don't want to be in a situation where we have to do a lot of auditing. We've got some franchise users right now, or right-of-way users, where we have to go through that process. And so it's a consideration to simplify that as well.
Mr. Mayberg?
I've got a number of questions and concerns. Is there a coverage requirement to be able to get the service? So like there needs to be one every quarter mile or something?
So the small cells coverage or capacity is around 1,000 feet, as opposed to the macro cells, which are generally like 22 to 40 miles.
So we're going to see a lot of these.
Yes, I've spoken to a number of telecommunication providers, and there will be I mean, it's estimated that 40% of operators will have 100 to 350 small cells per square mile in 2020.
Oh, my goodness.
And
That's just like FCC.
is there a strategic reason? I mean, it seems like there'd be a strategic reason for us to move on this quickly before any federalization gets into place so that we can be potentially grandfathered.
There has been some deployment by the FCC very recently. There's a September 5th, 2018 deployment, accelerating wireless broadband deployment by removing barriers to infrastructure investment. It's a 100-page document. And it does talk to the usage fees and the size of the small cells within those usage fee regulations. It talks to a small cell that's smaller than 3 cubic feet and ground equipment that's less than 28 cubic feet. And the usage fees for that would have to come from a reasonable cost from each municipality.
So they wouldn't have the right to say, you can't charge anything.
I think the only governing right would be Oregon's state legislation on that kind of stuff. From Oregon, from the 1996 Telecommunication Acts, Home Rule Authority was established within Oregon. And I can't really speak to that. I don't know what the federal government will come down with.
My caution is don't underestimate the power of the FCC.
Yeah.
And then just a general statement, these things can be visual clutter and they can be ugly. And I personally would be in favor of requirements that make these as attractive or as invisible as possible or as attractive as possible so that they blend in and not along the lines of the two rightmost pictures. I think that's hideous.
Yeah, and we're looking into all of that and looking into writing standards and codes that align with the needs and usage of the right-of-way and the residents of Oregon City.
Is the National League of Cities have any comment on this at this point, do you know?
Yes, they do. The National League of Cities and the League of Oregon Cities have both commented on the FCC's broadband deployment.
In support of cities?
In support of cities, yes.
In support of Home Rule, so it's
In
the US
support of
Conference
Home
Mayor.
Rule Authority, yes, especially within Oregon. But the FCC and Congress have both introduced legislation and bill with Home Rule Authority preemption in mind.
Any other questions?
What would the fees be used for?
Used for?
Yeah, I mean, it has a potential of being a, fairly healthy revenue source. Is the intent that it be reinvested into right-of-way improvements, or would it go to the general fund, or is it, what's the thinking
Mr. Conkle?
there?
I think this would be similar to the discussions we've had about the existing right-of-way fee program that we put up. It would come into the general fund. And I think that I know that the commission would then have discretion as to how those funds are allocated. With some of the right-of-way fees, remember we passed a resolution that some of those right-of-way fees will go into sanitary sewer I&I management. But then there was some of that we use for economic development, some of that we use for parks. So you do have quite a bit of broad authority on how those funds are appropriated.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Have a good day.
Good night.
Good job.
Welcome aboard.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to take about 3 or 4 minutes, and then we'll come back and go into our regular commission meeting.